Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola. I'm the editor of the Dissenter newsletter, also the host of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. And welcome to this channel. I'll give people a few moments to filter in. None of these streams are particularly huge. I don't have much success with the algorithms of YouTube at this point, and I don't stream very often. I think it's been more than a month since I had a chance to do a live stream, but there's a few of you who I see regularly. And then the nice thing is this video archives and people can watch this later if YouTube or Google allows you to find it at all. But I'd like to share an interview that I recorded for the Unauthorized Disclosure Weekly podcast, but then do it a little bit different. I usually, for people who listen to the show, have a kind of introduction. But this time, in addition to an introduction, I want to come back after playing the interview and discuss some of the things that are raised in it, and then kind of give people a rundown of what will happen in Chicago over the coming week, and discuss some of the coverage that I have planned for the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. So I'm based here, and this is somewhat outside of what I typically do. The Dissenter newsletter, if people are familiar who are tuning in, typically covers whistleblowers and surveillance, secrecy, government secrecy, and press freedom. And I wrote an article for people who are subscribers about what policing will mean for those who have come to Chicago. I expect to see hundreds, if not over 1,000 reporters from various states, cities throughout the country. There will even be people from Europe and other parts of the world that will have traveled to cover the Democratic National Convention. And, a main storyline is going to be that there are these continued protests against Israel's bombardment and genocidal violence in Gaza. And that's something I signed on to a letter over the past week that was put together by a coalition of organizations, but Defending Rights and Dissent, as well as the Courage Foundation, had a big part to play in getting journalists and media organizations together to sign on and demand that there be an embargo to the weapons that are being sent to the Israeli government, because we now have over 120 journalists, at least, that have been murdered as a result of this war. And so I signed on to this letter, and then the same week, $20 more billion were is sought after or granted to the Israeli government. I mean, we know that the Congress is going to rubber stamp it because that's what they do for all of these arms requests. There's no critical eye at all. There's barely little being done to put any constraints on what the Israeli government does, and we continue to see stories of brutality. And so back to Chicago here, those protests are going to be happening in parallel to the coronation and the pomp and circumstance of making Kamala Harris the Democratic Party's nominee for running against Donald Trump in the presidential election. And so here I am in Chicago. This is where I learned to be a journalist, covering protests and seeing police handle protests, handle anti-war demonstrations against the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. Paid close attention when the police deployed for the 2012 NATO summit. Then they were on the ground responding to Black Lives Matter protests. There was Occupy protests as well in Chicago, although Mayor Rahm Emanuel, Mayor 1%, never allowed a encampment. And then through the years, I've paid close attention to what organizers do here in Chicago. And I get to reconnect with people who I've long known or been familiar with over the last 10 to 15 years. So I'm looking forward to seeing them in the streets. And one of those people is Andy Thayer, who I want to get to. But first, before I go too much further, let me welcome you to this broadcast. I see I see VS Adams, so thank you. And then Pedro, welcome to this. And as the interview plays and we continue the stream, I'm sure there will be some other people who filter in. And so thank you for tuning in to this broadcast. And if you're not subscribers, the show is on patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure. And then also you can get to the podcast through thedissenter.org. All throughout August, I've paused billing and I'm offering just about everything that goes up there for free, giving people a break. But also, I felt that it was going to be difficult to try and put up the kind of articles that I try to do on a regular basis so that it's worth people paying money for a subscription, for a monthly subscription. And I want to also focus on trying to do some campaigning to get people to subscribe, because since I've been finished with covering Julian Assange's case, because he's free, I've lost a couple dozen subscribers, just I think because that's what they signed up for, and there's no coverage of that anymore, and they don't really maybe have interest in supporting my independent journalism any longer. I can only surmise that, though. I'm not sure because nobody's really specifically said that, but I can't think of any other reason. I suppose it could be financial, but a lot of people are very kind and usually tell me that they're having financial issues and they hope to come back soon. And that's why they're not subscribing any longer. So there's a fair amount of people who are leaving just because there's no longer an Assange case. And that's pretty disappointing to me, because I'm trying to build something that outlasts and is much bigger and broader than a political case against one single individual. But that aside, I have this interview for you to play as we are on the eve of all the delegates coming, the politicians that will be in the city of Chicago. I'm sure many of them are already here. There are activist organizations that have evening events. There's going to be a lot of alternative independent media that'll be here. I hope to connect with them, say hello. Some of them are friends and colleagues. And there will be marches and demonstrations. Several of them, I think 7 or 8 of them at least, are permitted, in that these groups applied to the city in order to get a kind of march route or an authorization, give them some additional protection. It makes it harder for the police to get away with just dispersing them and deciding that they no longer can be out having their mass gathering. So with that, Andy Thayer is a longtime Chicago activist and organizer, known for being part of LGBT liberation movement, specifically here in Chicago, part of a coalition called Bodies Outside of Unjust Laws. I do a tiny introduction, but Andy has done work seeking permits for demonstrations against the Iraq War, the NATO summit. He's always been somebody on the ground who goes around, streams protests, streams press conferences, sticks up for people who are working on a grassroots level to organize in the city of Chicago. And I know him as a friend and colleague too, because I'm working on a little project now called ChicagoActivismHub.org. So this is specifically for people who are in the area, and I'll have a little bit more to say after the interview, but let me just put this up here. This ChicagoActivismHub.org doesn't have anything to do with my dissenter project. This is outside of that. The ChicagoActivismHub.org, outside of, no, I'm using the dissenter colors there. It's a separate thing with some people here in the Chicagoland area where I'm based. And it's part of this tradition developed by indie media centers going all the way back to the Battle of Seattle against the World Trade Organization, and the protests with labor unions were involved. There were also activists, and thereafter there were groups that set up indie media centers throughout the country, way before the revolution in online journalism and online technology and social media. There was independent media centers that were uh, a hub basically for people to go, and the calendar was extremely useful in that groups could post their marches, their scheduled rallies, their planned events, and mobilize the communities to those actions. And then a lot of those went away, and the sites were no longer being updated. And we see so much factionalism and everything. And he explains it in the interview. But I'm working on this as it's a bulletin board, and it is a place right now that you can find all of the major activist events that are taking place during the DNC. So, with that out of the way, here's the interview. I'm gonna step aside. I'll play it. You can hear the conversation, and then I'll come back. I have some more to add before I wrap up the live stream, and then I'll be happy to respond to any questions or comments that you might have. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this interview with Andy Thayer. And Andy is a longtime activist in Chicago, and he's currently involved in organizing with a feminist LGBTQ and pro-Palestinian coalition called Bodies Outside of Unjust Laws. And also, I hear working with a small outfit that's put together something for people to figure out what's going on in Chicago called the Chicago Activism Hub, a kind of bulletin board. We'll be getting to that. But with the DNC coming in the next week, I have Andy here to talk about organizing marches and demonstrations in protest of the Democrats. So welcome, Andy.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
And so to begin, tell us a little bit about organizing bodies outside of unjust laws, seeking the permit, going to the city, asking for it, and you're going to have this demonstration on Sunday, right as DNC delegates and others are arriving, journalists arriving, many people from outside the city who are going to protest are going to be arriving as well.
That's right, Kevin. It's going to be the first march of the whole DNC. Our coalition was formed actually last fall when we knew that the DNC was coming, and many of us who are reproductive justice activists were very angry, frankly, that the Democrats were very good at using our issues to get themselves elected and get themselves power. But over the last half century, following the passage of Roe v. Wade, they hadn't done squat to protect reproductive rights, and especially, of course, abortion, that many of them had been voting routinely and in massive numbers for the so-called Hyde Amendment, which is an annual thing that has passed every single damned year that denies federal aid to people who need abortions. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. Anyone who knows the history, for example, of our fight for equal LGBTQ rights knows that as often as not, the Democrats were our number one opponents in that fight. Barack Obama, as a state senator, was in favor of LGBT, equal marriage rights. Then when he was running for president, he switched that off. And then years later, he once again got with a program. Actually, one of our primary opponents in the fight for equal marriage rights was none other than gay Democratic Congressman Barney Frank. And you see this over and over again, where in a version of the old adage that only Nixon can go to China, it was Republican judges who were overwhelmingly the ones ruling in favor of equal marriage rights in the early years, whether in Massachusetts, California, and elsewhere. And it was the Democrats, particularly in this state, when we were fighting for equal marriage rights, who were our primary opponents. So some of us who've got a bit of a track record on these issues, wanted to make sure if the Democrats are going to be singing the right tune on the issue of abortion, on the issue of LGBTQ rights, we're going to hold their heats to the fire. And the old adage from Frederick Douglass, justice concedes nothing without a demand, never has, never will. And what we have seen is the left has been going easy on the Democrats whenever the Democrats get into power. And this has been going on for decades now. So we started out, decades ago where the far right of the Republican Party was the so-called Tea Party. As the Democrats kept on moving right, trying to steal the Republicans' thunder, the Republican Party in turn moved further right, so as to carve out a space for itself, so that now the far right of the Republican Party is the so-called, these neo-fascists of various sorts, the 2%ers and whatever. So our concern is that the problem with politics in this country is a function not just of the far right Republicans, not just of the moderate Republicans who enable them, and not just of, frankly, the mainstream Democrats such as Bill Clinton et al., who've accommodated and moved to the right to steal their thunder. It also is a problem of the left, the various groups, whether they call themselves Marxist or not, who go easy on the Democrats when they're in power. I vividly remember that when we had George W. Bush in power, people were going down to his hometown of Crawford, Texas, so as to protest against the Iraq War. Once Obama got into office and continued those same wars, we tried to get people to go down to Hyde Park right here in Chicago. It wasn't a trek of hundreds of miles, and yet it was pulling teeth. They were all afraid to do anything to protest against the president who called these wars dumb wars, and yet escalated both the Afghanistan invasion as well as the Iraq invasion. He gave carte blanche, as you know, Kevin, to the torturers who were littered about the previous administration, the Dick Cheneys and everyone else down who signed off on waterboarding the secret CIA prisons in probably half a dozen plus countries, on and on and on and on. So there's been a lot of enablement along the way. And the left, the far left, is not blameless in this. So some of us set out to say, we have got to protest against the Democrats from the left. It's not good enough to just click a box and say, I'm in favor of reproductive justice. You have to actually demonstrate that you're doing something about it. That's one of my biggest problems with these NGOs that are, most typically aligned with the Democrats, is that they'll send out these candidate questionnaires and say, oh, you're in favor of that. Okay, very good, very good, very good. But they don't judge people about what they actually do. And then, of course, there's gossip.
Yeah, and these NGOs have their fine breakfasts planned for the week of the DNC. And you can come and discuss racial injustices with them while they have their eggs and waffles and whatever is going to be served. And that's just not going to cut it, because we see with Project 2025 and the agenda that Donald Trump is putting forward, how threatening it is to all, I don't know how you want to refer to them, what's more appropriate, but usually they're talked about as marginalized people or those who are engaged in struggles for their equal rights and dignity and justice. And we know all of that will be completely obliterated. Any struggle will be completely reversed, and any progress reversed if there's a second term of Trump. And up to this point, it hasn't seemed like the Democrats have recognized the threat, which is why it's so important for protests. And also why I think, and maybe you'll have a difference of opinion, but I heard Medea Benjamin, one of the co-founders of Code Pink, complain about the lack of people protesting in Milwaukee during the Republican National Convention, and how there were so few people in the media were trying to figure out where are all the activists. And I almost think it has to do with, well, there's no point in protesting Donald Trump.
I frankly don't agree.
Okay, great.
And here's why. That The history of greatest social progress in this country has never been determined by who is in the White House. The history of greatest social progress has not been diminished by the political affiliation of who is in the White House. The previous early 20th century period of great social progress happened when we had a very patrician, democratic president who probably the only working class people he knew were his servants, and probably couldn't have been less interested in working class people until mass strikes, 3 general strikes in 1934, forced him to think otherwise. It was the mass organizing at the time that made FDR change his tune. Going to 68, which is more apropos, shall we say, to our current situation, Richard Milhous Nixon was by all measures the most liberal president of the late 20th century when counted in terms of what programs he enacted. This peace-loving, wonderful guy wound down the war on Southeast Asia. This wonderful, not anti-Semite, not racist, I'm being facetious here, quintupled food stamps. He rolled out many of the survival programs that helped people in poor and people of color communities. He did it because there was a mass movement in the streets forcing him to do so. And Nixon packed Supreme Court, of course, gave us Roe v. Wade, not because they wanted to, but because of mass radicalized women's movement. We got the Environmental Protection Act. You can go down the list of all the things that this bastard did, not because he wanted to. And my argument to those who say that the sky is going to fall in if Trump wins is that we have to do what we did in the early months of the 2016 term, when we flooded the airports with masses of people in response to Trump's racist shit. And we have to step up our game because, polite CD isn't good enough. That we have to truly fuck things up if this fucker, this serial lawbreaker who doesn't give a shit about our constitutional niceties, why should we? By the way, the response to Laquan McDonald police murder that our own former mayor covered up, it was much the same thing. The cops couldn't do shit because black youth flooded the streets of Chicago night after night after night after the release of the Laquan McDonald murder video. That's the sort of thing we need to do. When either of these jackasses who are in office from whatever party try to do what they really want to do. And the problem has been is that we react when the Republicans do this, but when the Democrats do the same goddamn thing, it's people sitting on their hands. And one of the worst aspects of this is, frankly, the liberal NGOs that are tied to the hip with the Democratic Party. It's a revolving door. Oh, the Democrats are out of office. Let me get a job at such and such foundation. The Republicans do the same damn thing with their folks. But this convention next week is all going to be about passing out business cards for jobs and getting, drunk and eating fine food. It's not about policy.
Yep.
It's about jobs. It's about networking. It's about building their own goddamn power. And for the fools who fall for the, wonderful spectacle, they might as well be watching the closing ceremonies of the Olympics. It's got as much political content. It's one big goddamn infomercial. I, for one, hate watching commercials. Give me the show. Give me the actual policies. Oh no, it's not about that. We still only by hints have heard what Kamala actually is going to do on Israel, but don't fool yourself. She is 100% behind this current genocide. The only reason why she's getting any pause is because people have been protesting in the streets calling her Killer Kamala and are not going to accept words or change of tone until they stop seeing aid to Israel, the billions of dollars that just in the past few weeks that the Biden Harris regime has shipped there. I mean,
Right.
this is one of the things in terms of this free speech fight that the coalition, the March on the DNC, why it was so important, because they were trying to squelch Palestinian voices during a genocide that's happening right now. According to Democracy Now!, some 1% of Gaza's population has died. According to the British medical journal, The Lancet, they're projecting 186,000 deaths, or 8% of Gaza's population. And that isn't counting the many times that number who are injured, the psychological trauma of having 2 million people out of a population of 2.1 or 2.2 homeless. I mean, just the trauma of those who survive is, I don't think, anything that people in this country can come to terms with unless they've had themselves been victims of mass gun violence. It's just, and the Democrats are allowing it happen. So excuse us if some of us, we don't say that the Democrats are the same as the Republicans. That's always been a shibboleth thrown at us. I've never known anyone on the left who thinks that the Democrats are the exact same thing as Republicans. But when it comes to people dying in Gaza of starvation right now, of withered children that you see on things like Democracy Now!, who are starving thanks to Israel blockading the territory. Sorry, Harris and Biden could stop this right now.
I think people would be stunned to learn that Biden actually outpaced Donald Trump in the first year when it came to deportations, that he was actually deporting people at a faster rate than Trump in his first year. And why? Because what you just said, I entirely agree with. All that protest slowed down the machinery of the Trump administration. And you're absolutely right that no matter who's in the White House, the task of us is to slow down all of this.
Reverse
all this
it. We can reverse.
We need to reverse it. Yes. Yeah. But let me ask you. So I didn't plan to go off on this for a long time, but it was an important exchange. What I do want to ask you before I'm done speaking with you about the Chicago police who are going to be in the city, in Chicago. I mean, there's this specter that hangs over them, rightfully so, of what unfolded in 1968. But there was a DNC in 1996. I would like to work my way up to the present and say that one of the first times I really got to have an exchange with you and become more familiar with the work that you were doing was during the NATO summit of 2012. And I asked you for a quote for an article, and I raised this again because the Chicago police chief, although they call it a superintendent in this city, the chief of police, Larry Snelling, is going around holding up the NATO summit as this shiny example of how the police can manage protests without violating people's civil liberties. What do you say to that?
That's a joke. For one thing, they did the same thing that they're doing today and have done, frankly, starting with Richard J. Daley in '68, which is denying people permits to protest until the very last minute, if at all. We got that permit, again, filing right on the very first day we possibly could. They tried to run out the clock on us. We actually won the permit initially because the city violated its own permit ordinance. Then they changed the date of the NATO summit, and so we had to apply again, and they denied the exact same permit that they had been forced to grant before. What ultimately happened was enormous pressure was put on then Mayor Rahm Emanuel And about a week and a half before the summit, thanks to ACLU and a host of others, we finally got our permit for Sunday's march just a little over a week before the march. And we applied for that permit on the very first day we legally could under Section 10-8-330 of the Chicago Municipal Code. We were in our one of at least a half dozen organizations that applied for permits. The only other group that had won a permit at that point was the Poor People's Army, which is going to be marching from Humboldt Park beginning at 4 p.m. on Monday. We just got the permit for the Coalition to March on the DNC the other day, and then it was had all sorts of bullshit riders to it, preventing them from having a stage and sound. And literally just a couple of hours ago, the city was finally forced to relent on those ridiculous restrictions, in part due to a Chicago Tribune editorial lambasting them. This is the Republican of the McCain variety that never sides with protesters. In fact, was formed by one Robert McCormick, who is infamous for encouraging people to mow down the Haymarket martyrs and anyone else who countered big business. Anyway, they sided with the protesters in terms of the city's ridiculous response. And this from a so-called progressive mayor. And we really laid into Johnson, and he deserved it. And this, we can't follow the same pattern of leftists of old where we're nice to our friends even when they're being bad. You got to call them out. This is ridiculous. Basically, Brandon Johnson has given carte blanche to Superintendent Snelling to behave the way the Chicago police have always behaved. And let me just lay it out for you because it's thick. This is the same city that became notorious in the late 70s and 80s for allowing a police torture ring that tortured at least 100 black men and has cost the city as a result many, many, many millions of dollars. And these cases continue on here in the new century about this police torture. That's just one thing. Then we've got Ronaldo Guevara. I was an activist working with a number of the family members on those cases where this Latinx cop made a sport out of framing Latinx people in his own community for murder, framing them on charges, getting false confessions, sending people up for 2 and sometimes 3+ decades for murders they didn't commit, with the result, obviously, of those families being destroyed, the murder still being on the loose, and the fact is now I believe it's 45 people have been exonerated, found not guilty of the crimes for which they served decades in prison, and that's going to cost the city hundreds of millions of dollars. And then there was the ring of cops led by a guy named Sergeant Ronald Watts, who is shaking down black people in one of the biggest CHA projects, which has caused the city of Chicago to become the wrongful conviction capital of North America. Over 200 wrongful convictions out of just that crew of cops, of dirty cops who were shaking down people in the projects, people who are poor already, forcing them to give bribes or lock them up. And this is just this is a city that was forced to sign a consent decree about its unconstitutional policing back in 2019, and through a series of mayors, has only complied with some 8% of the provisions of that consent decree. We've been through 3 mayors now under this shit, starting with Rahm Emanuel, and then it just makes me angry. Our current mayor, a so-called progressive, ran on a campaign in part saying that he would not allow members of the Proud Boys, the racist, sexist, anti-LGBT Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, to be in the ranks of the CPD. And yet It was revealed thanks to some investigative journalists and some leaks, some hacking, whatever, that there were several, maybe a dozen plus of these cops that we know of that are members of these organizations. And yet Superintendent Snelling has refused to dismiss them from the police. And Mayor Johnson is acting like Ronald Snelling, or Larry Snelling, I should say, is the mayor of Chicago because he's letting this happen. Larry Snelling denied every single permit to march on the DNC. He's the one who put our group and the Coalition to March on the DNC, forced us into federal court just simply to win the right to exercise our First Amendment. So when Larry Snelling goes around the city, these dog and pony shows, and these corporate journalists just sit back and be stenographers, as he says, we're going to respect constitutional policing. I keep on telling him, look at the evidence. Don't just take their word any more than you should take Donald Trump's word on anything. And it makes me so angry that heretofore, at least, they've just been lapping up this garbage about how the city of Chicago police, oh yeah, they're going to turn over a new leaf and respect people's rights. Okay, prove it. Because everything we've done heretofore hasn't.
So all these people from out of town are going to come here, and maybe they get a chance to see another bullshit line that's coming out of Larry Snelling's mouth, which I'd like you to address. And it's the idea that we will allow you to have your right to protest, but all of these police, and there's going to be police from departments from throughout the state of Illinois, as well as Milwaukee police who were partners. They went to Milwaukee, the Chicago police did, for the RNC. So you're going to have all those police, so thousands upon thousands of police in the streets. And they're going to watch your march. They're going to watch the Coalition for Palestine's march. And they're going to watch the Poor People's Army's march, anybody else that's out there. Mm-hmm. And when they think they've got like an itch behind their ear that you're going to turn your protest into a riot, they're going to just sick their forces on you and disperse you.
Protesting and rioting are two different things. The moment that starts, we're going to intervene. I am not going to wait until it gets out of control and then try to bring it back in.
And they're going to be right. They want us to believe that they're going to be right, that you were going to commit criminal acts or engage in violent activity and needed to be dispersed. I mean, what do you think about all of that?
Well, I mean, we've seen the script before. And again, to have it happening under a supposedly left progressive mayor just makes it that much more insulting. As you may recall, Kevin, in the run-up to the 2012 NATO conference here in Chicago, our then admittedly odious to anyone who had a brain on their head, Mayor Rahm Emanuel, introduced something called the Sit Down and Shut Up Ordinance, which dramatically escalated the penalties for violating the city permit law and much else beside. It was pretty horrible. And the good thing is that people fought against it, both people in the council as well as many people outside of the council. This was at a time when Occupy was a thing and was vibrant, and people, were mobilized already, and fortunately pushed back on a lot of the worst provisions of this. This year, we had our so-called progressive mayor. He himself introduced a security perimeter ordinance, which is totally open-ended about what can be allowed within this as yet to be defined security perimeter. Supposedly not pointed objects. They explicitly ban things like tripods. Hello, journalists. And carts. Hello, protest organizers bringing sound. And pointed objects, which could be anything like pins. And it is so, and the police superintendent explicitly is allowed under the ordinance to, on the spot, add additional items. And of course, there's, prison sentence, jail time at least for this. I can't remember the specific provisions, but it's so patently unconstitutional. It's laughable. Part of our ACLU lawsuit, in order to get our permit, we took this on, and unfortunately, at least at this point, we have lost. We'll see what further iterations happen. But they always introduce these scary ordinances on the eve of these so-called national special security events. Every mayor does it, no matter where the convention is or what have you, to scare people away from exercising their First Amendment rights. We see this script rolled out over and over and over again. I was in Boston for the, must have been like the 2004 convention or something way back in the dark ages that most of your listeners were too young to remember. Anyway, it was people were saying, native Bostonians were saying, boy, they told us it was going to be traffic Armageddon in terms of no parking, couldn't get around. It was the freest, easiest parking because they scared all the locals to going out of town. I mean, literally vacating the city because everyone thought, oh, this is just going to be a mess. And the brutally ironic thing about all this is that the local business people, those who were not totally on the inside track, lost their shirts in terms of business because their regular clientele wasn't there. The out-of-town people who were supposed to be filling their bars, et cetera, weren't there. And so they totally lost their shirt. And this happens over and over again. Another very typical thing, and we've had it this time in Chicago, is clean out the homeless encampments because we can't have rich and powerful people seeing homeless people. No, we live in the good old USA where everyone has housing, right? And so Mayor Johnson cleared out a longtime homeless encampment right by the Dan Ryan Expressway. And it's just criminal, Kevin. It's just fucking criminal. Be hosting this big fucking party for these fat cats. And we live in a country that spends as much on its military as the next 10 nations combined. We could be housing everyone, long-term homeless as well as the migrants that Texas has been sending us. It's just criminal. We have got all sorts of vacant storefronts in this town that could be housing people. The Catholic Archdiocese, well over a year ago, we just learned a few months ago, had offered to the city of Chicago rent-free its vacant schools in parish buildings for the migrants. Instead, our mayor contracted out to some really shady outfits, business people making millions of dollars, providing grossly substandard and dangerous facilities for the migrants. It's just been such a fuck up, pardon my French, by our so-called progressive mayor. And I think he means well. That's the sad thing about it. But he's listening to all the old guard, whether it's the CPD or the city hall bureaucrats. And what this does is watch out next election. The evil Paul Vallis or the evil Lori Lightfoot or some other jackass of that sort will come back and be our mayor because of the failings of our current so-called progressive mayor. It's really sad. And the one thing that I have to say, the one thing where I've got lots of optimism is I think that, and I wrote a soon-to-be appearing, believe it or not, Chicago Tribune guest column appearing on Sunday, supposedly, about how the great similarity between 1968 and today is mass youth disaffection from traditional institutions, both parties, legacy media, religion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is a totally positive thing in my book. I mean, the liberals hate it. They think, oh my God, no one watches CBS News anymore. Yeah, people do, but whatever. The point is that this mass disaffection combined with mass action has been the two primary ingredients needed for the mass struggles that gave us all of our rights, whether in the 1930s or late 60s, early 70s. And one of the, back in 68, our convention actually played a pivotal role in the growth of consciousness because people had no faith in Richard Nixon any more than people got faith in Donald Trump in terms of young people who are radicalized on the left. And so the Miami convention in 68, the Milwaukee convention in this year, really quite small protests and nothing to write home about, as you well know, Kevin. People flocked to the Democratic conventions. And I believe people are flocking to Chicago beginning on Sunday and through the course of the convention because they are angry that the party that says it's for decent things isn't doing the decent things. Back in 68, people literally had their heads knocked out of their noggins, the notion that the Democratic Party could be their friend. Mayor Daley's cops busted people's heads, and the whole notion of the Democrats being a party that could be changed and turned into something nice, the way that Bernie Sanders et al. Might want us to make us think, that was knocked out of people's heads. The ongoing slaughter in Gaza is doing that for many people that are young today who have been following the news. And I think that is a very positive development because when our movements have been independent from both major parties, have not allowed them to be incorporated the way that previous movements have been, that's when their biggest strength. In 1968, I'm very fond of telling this story. Sorry if you've heard it before. In August 1968, there was not a chapter of the Chicago Black Panther Party. No chapter in the city, period. Just about a year and a half later, the Chicago Black Panther Party chapter was so fucking powerful, was influencing so many people that a local state's attorney and a host of Chicago cops felt compelled to assassinate the leader of the Black Panthers Party here in Chicago, as well as the Illinois chapter as well. That's how powerful they were. I've written about the significance of the Stonewall Rebellion, June 1969 in New York City, that birthed the modern queer movement. There had been 3 previous rebellions, by my count at least, maybe more besides that, and nothing had come out of them. The difference with Stonewall 1969 in June of that year was that many of those same activists had been to Chicago or had learned the lessons of Chicago. They were anti-war activists as well as budding gay rights organizers. And so when this particular rebellion came, there was actual organizing after it. It was organizing on a totally different plane where gay people said, if we're gonna get freedom, we got to do it for ourselves. No more appealing to the damn psychological professionals, the medical professionals, or the politicians. We have to do it ourselves. This self-emancipation was at the center of what the Black Panthers were about. It was self-emancipation was at the center of what the radicalized women's movement was about that gave us Roe v. Wade. And that's really, if we even get a hint of that out of this convention and the shitty way the Democrats are going to treat us, it's not going to send people over to the Republicans of these youth. People will hopefully see if we want change, it's unfair. It shouldn't be this way, but we're the ones who have to do it because our so-called betters sure as hell aren't. That's my hope for this convention. And whoever the fuck wins in November, we need to fight.
Well, first of all, it needs to be mentioned that there was a black site operated by police during the NATO summit and before and after that people were being disappeared to. And there's 65 legal organizations and attorneys. They are raising this issue and just making sure that, we don't really know where people are going to be taken after they're arrested, do we? Or is it still an issue?
Where we might be taken to is the Belmont and Western Police Station. They're going to be opening up a special court there. And you're absolutely right you're going back to in terms of NATO 2012. They jacked up 3 young kids from Florida. And they literally framed them on serious felony charges by undercover Chicago Police Department officers, plying them with liquor to get them to say stupid things on tape, going so far as to, arrange to get the building blocks for Molotov cocktails for them and so forth. These were kids that had some serious substance abuse issues and so on and so forth. And they held this bust like 3 days before the NATO summit so as to totally hype this terrorism comes to Chicago. And the Chicago Tribunes et al., the of the world. It was just red meat for them. They went totally fucking crazy. And as it turns out, of course, it was a one big ridiculous frame up. We also found out, we suspected it at the time, that the one major coalition that held the biggest march, of which I was a part, that our meetings were infiltrated by sworn CPD officers. We found this, we suspected it at the time, and we got later FOIA that you or the city did admit that they had sworn police officers monitoring our almost every meeting, is right up to the summit itself. I mean, the funny thing about that is you can use that against them, in that we basically said we're marching whether we get a permit or not, knowing full well that they're cops there taking notes. And that's also played a role in us getting a permit.
And then I have to mention, because you talked about the homeless or the houselessness of people that people are dealing with, that Barack Obama, who's now known in the Democratic Party as not speaking out on anything, maybe going kite surfing with Richard Branson, but behind the scenes pulling strings and making phone calls to be the kingmaker. Meanwhile, he's building this library that isn't even a library, that no academics can even expect to go into and see and view archives like you normally would with a presidential library. There's no value to it other than it being a shrine to his ego. And people are being tossed out of their homes, and the gentrification is completely awful on the South Side.
Yeah. And fortunately, there are, local groups who are probably voted for the man, probably to the tune of like 95%. And they said, we just want a community benefits agreement. And the Obama Center refused over and over again. Now, I understand that there was something that was agreed to, but probably far less than what it should be. I mean, it is going to be a big phallic symbol to our former president. And I guess as a gay man, I shouldn't be opposed to that, but whatever. See, adding sex to your show, Kevin. Okay, I'm going to boost your ratings. But in all seriousness, the Democrats are about for the rich. And that's the sad truth. And that's what gives the Republicans the opportunity to say, hey, they're just Hollywood liberals, join the MAGA crowd and be for the working man. Also, they're, perennial betrayals of working class voters through refusing to pass things like card check, repealing NAFTA, and a number of literally decades old promises that we've had out of them. So only we can free us. That's the bottom line.
All right, so let's get to the freeing us, and then we'll end the interview. The protests and demonstrations for the week. Is there anything particular other than we mentioned Sunday at 5 o'clock?
5 o'clock, Michigan and Wacker rally in the street on Wacker, followed by a march on Michigan. On Monday, the 19th, there's 12 noon at Union Park. That's Coalition to March on the DNC. There is 4 p.m. Poor People's Army starting in the south end of Humboldt Park, again marching on the United Center. Then on Wednesday, which could be, I hope, could be the most dynamic protest of them all, which is organized by the Chicago Coalition for Justice in Palestine, an unpermitted march. And you know why they decided to go unpermitted? Because they had gotten a promise from the CPD before the CPD destroyed the last student encampment, that the CPD was going to give them a couple hours notice before they did anything. Well, of course, they broke their promise. And they did it the very morning that the Chicago Coalition for Justice in Palestine was preparing to file its permit with a press conference in front of City Hall. They heard from the students about this raid going on. And at that press conference, a few hours later, they ripped up their permit application in front of the cameras and said, we can't trust the CPD on anything. They violated their promise. So we were going to march without a permit. That's going to be starting at Union Park. Official start time is 4 p.m., but things in community start later typically. But this is the group anchored in foremost part by American Muslims for Palestine, which is the largest Palestinian political organization in the Chicago area, and our area is the largest concentration of Palestinian Americans in the United States. They are going to be marching from Union Park Wednesday, probably around 4:30 or 5, actually, on the United Center without a permit. And by the way, that is the same day that typically the nominee flies in. So you could get this very interesting split screen of mass Palestinian demonstration with Air Force Two flying in. If the DNC is stupid enough to allow us that split screen, it'll be marvelous. And then the last publicly announced protest is on Thursday, the 21st, again beginning at 5 p.m. at Union Park, again organized by the Coalition to March on the DNC. And I should add that there's a shitload of more stuff going on, and we're part of a new website called ChicagoActivismHub.org. There you go. There's the promo right there. Maybe you can put the QR code up on the screen or something after you edit this, Kevin. But we are aiming to have every left of center non-electoral event, whether it's a protest, a forum, or whatever, both before, during, and after, going into the future, listed on this site, because social media has become so damn balkanized, and the algorithms screw with us, whether you're talking about YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, etc., that people don't have time to be on like a half dozen different platforms. We aim to have this site being a central clearinghouse where people can post about their event, and so that everyone can find out about it and not be restricted by the algorithms. So ChicagoActivismHub.org. Check it out. If you're anywhere in the Chicago area, I think you'll find it very useful. Many journalists have complimented us on, finally, we have one place where you can find all this info.
Yeah. And lastly, if there's anyone who wants to volunteer, because we're going to need people to keep this up, I'm actually involved in trying to make sure that this site has a one-stop shop for activism in Chicago. You can contact Andy. You can contact me, and we'll get you set up so that you can be part of this volunteer effort to make it easier for us to not be totally separated and factionalized here in Chicago. So, Andy, it's been really good to talk with you, and I'll see you in the streets.
Sounds great, Kevin. Good luck to you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for staying through the interview. I followed the chat and the few who are chatting. Not sure how much of the interview you were able to appreciate, but I'm glad that you're here paying attention to the channel. And there was someone who stopped by and took some issue. They were seeking some left perspective, that they're upset that people on the left are intolerant of certain groups of people. And you're still here, James. Okay, so I'd like to talk about some of the issues raised in the interview, but I'll go ahead and put James's comment up just because I want to presume that you're genuinely interested in an answer. You're still here, and so I'll go ahead and address your question. Why do you people vilify the right? Anti-vaxxers are monsters. Christians are fools. January 6th protesters are Nazis or were Nazis, and Trump voters are racist. It goes on and on. You guys are so tolerant. And what I'll say to this is I've never used that language. I have my objections to people who oppose vaccines. I have my opinions about people who are a part of imposing their moral values on others and saying that their doctrine is what other people should follow. That's what I'm intolerant. I do not tolerate puritanical culture that says that the art I wish to consume, that says the choices that I wish to make, that says that the individual liberties I would like to enjoy are off limits because of religious teachings, because of things that people believe that exist in the afterlife or whatever. As for the January 6th protesters being Nazis, I haven't done a lot of coverage of January 6th. I presume there were a small number that share some of the views of far-right groups that are white supremacist, but be that as it may, I've never painted them with a broad brush and said that those people there were anything more than angry people who legitimately thought, because Trump told them and because they had consumed media that told them this, that they thought Joe Biden was stealing the election and they needed to get to Capitol Hill to stop Joe Biden from stealing the election from Donald Trump. Now, Trump voters are not racist. This is kind of like a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. Yeah, Trump voters are not all racist, but a lot of racists are interested in voting for Donald Trump. And that just has to do with what Donald Trump is saying on a daily basis when it comes to his policies. So you want a left perspective on why those people get vilified. I don't think it's the same thing of Donald Trump and his cohorts coming up with nicknames for all the people in the administration, that of Biden's administration and any Democrat. It's always like Sleepy Joe, or like the left calls Joe Biden Genocide Joe. That actually is rooted in something that has to do with injustice and human rights. Donald Trump's nicknames are just schoolyard bullying, and actually they're not even really that good anymore. And he's absolutely recycling them now. But I would say that the intolerance of the left is nothing compared to the intolerance that is projected by the Republican Party. I don't even really understand what you're trying to put your finger on here as like a problem of the left when it comes to tolerance, because I'm simply not going to tolerate the actions. I'm going to focus on actions. This isn't about people. I mean, I don't know who these people are unless I meet them in person and I see them. I don't have anything to conclude about them individually. And so I focus on the actions of people. I focus on where they come down on issues, and then I engage with them in that respect. And so that probably doesn't answer your question, but I'm not going to budge from my position that I don't see these groups as entirely unjustly vilified by parts of the left, because there are things that are coming from these groups that are toxic to life and society. But also, I don't think the left is going around being demeaning to them, and their views are very, like, as I say, very sound in what they've concluded. But back to the interview. I don't want to take too much more time here, but there are some things to say. about the DNC. The DNC is in Chicago. So I'll set the extracurricular activities aside for now and focus on what is going to unfold over the next week. As I look forward to being out there in the streets, and maybe someone watching this video will be from the Chicago area, and perhaps I'll encounter you while we are there. And I'm going to hide this chat because, yeah. All right. So let me focus on the stuff that I have to finish. And I thought that the point that Andy was making about disaffected youth in 1968 versus 2024 is a very sound kind of observation. There are a lot of national news media organizations, the journalists parachuting in, they're all coming here and they're going to be like, oh, we can't wait to see what the violence looks like here and how the police screw this all up because 1968, now it's not 2024, and there's so many. And I would say if you're coming here for 1968, you're probably not going to get it. But if you're coming here because you see a Democratic Party that is supporting a war on Gaza that has left over 40,000 people dead at least, and that 186,000 people or more by the time this is all said and done, the starvation, there's polio spreading, there's cholera, people are living in sewage, there's no hospitals, there's no schools, all the infrastructure that you need to survive, that kind of thing is missing. The complete and total decimation of the Gaza Strip. Now you have settlers, colonizers attacking people in the West Bank, the torture, the rape, the sexual assaults of not just even women that are captured, but detainees who are men as well, the rabid defense of soldiers who are humiliating Palestinians, who are videoing that and taking photos, those who are engaged in war crimes, who then you're seeing riots happen and they're saying, oh, free those people. There's only like a smidgen of people committing atrocious acts that are going to be held accountable, but then there are mobs trying to free them from any accountability. Back here in the United States, the government is defending all of those people. And mind you, also there's the 120 plus journalists that have been massacred as well. And the censorship regime that's been imposed from within Israel, banning Al Jazeera English, banning any organizations from working and getting footage from Al Jazeera, the hostility towards Arab news media. And so people can't even go into Gaza. There's a blackout from media and left to cover those people who, now I don't even know how they do any news reporting from Gaza because it's so inhospitable in Gaza. The U.S. is supporting this, arming, continuing this. There's all these very empty, vacuous discussions of ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, and none of them get to the fact that, they assassinated the guy who was negotiating on behalf of Hamas. Israel did. And you need people at the table to come up with an agreement to end all of this. The CIA was seriously involved. Bill Burns, the CIA director, was involved. And then one of the negotiators gets assassinated. How serious are you about ending this? It seems like the Biden administration is pretty much on board with this genocide. And that's why there will be 10,000, 12,000. I don't know how many total, but that's why there's going to be thousands upon thousands of people in the city of Chicago during the week. And maybe not on Sunday, maybe not on Monday, but by Wednesday, there will certainly have been thousands upon thousands of demonstrators against the DNC. And this will be the main issue that the Democrats seek to avoid and pretend like it won't impact them. But Chicago, it's unlucky for them that they scheduled the DNC here in Chicago, where in this country, this has the highest concentration, concentration of Palestinians out of any place in the nation. It's kind of like Dearborn, Michigan, in the swing state that Democrats have to win in order to defeat Donald Trump. Well, that has such a large Arab American population. And here in Chicago, there will be number of groups that are Palestinian that will be marching. They're going to have the unpermitted march on Wednesday that Andy was discussing. And so I feel like that's going to be a main event. And that's like, as the nominee for the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris comes into town, there's going to be this massive march happening, and they're going to go where they can go before police tell them they can't walk any further. So it's going to be up to the city of Chicago what kind of backdrop they want to give to Democrats. You want to allow them to express themselves, or are you going to feel threatened by the message of these demonstrators and shut them down? We'll see. And I will probably, other reporters along with myself, will probably be taking a risk to be out there. And I think demonstrators might be taking a risk, but I think I should be out there to bear witness to whatever takes place, because this is the thing that the Democrats really need to face head on. I mean, this is ugly, but this really shows that the Democrats are not about human rights. This really shows that they, shouldn't be speaking about other countries. They shouldn't be lecturing Russia or China when they back Israel in this manner, where there isn't anything that the Israeli government can do that the Biden administration won't look the other way through their spokespeople, particularly at the State Department. Anytime a reporter raises any objections, we've talked about these clips so many times on this channel, and I've done it with my colleague Rania Khalek, who is the co-host of Unauthorized Disclosure, who I speak with, and we do a show exclusively for subscribers every month. And she's a co-host of Breakthrough News, and she's been doing some fine work, but she's been so exhausted and just tired of all of the lying and the sociopathic nature of these spokespeople to rationalize the genocidal violence of Israel on a daily basis, and basically say up is down, left is right, do all this rewriting of history, denying facts, creating alternative facts. And what they said about Donald Trump making up his own reality, well, that's what the Biden administration does every day that they're questioned about the actions of Israel. They make up their own reality. And so this week coming up, it's about that fault line. And it's not going to be the fault of any protesters if it gets ugly. If it gets ugly, that's on the Chicago police, and that's on the city of Chicago, because I don't really think any of these people who are out there demonstrating are, here to do anything more than to try and get the Democrats to recognize that there are human beings who are suffering and are being massacred daily, and it must stop. And inside the convention, we'll see if the uncommitted delegates do anything to raise their voice and are given any time at all to speak on this issue, which is what they wanted to be able to do when they thought Biden would be the nominee. And I would presume they still would like to, with Harris as the nominee. So I'd like to play a clip of the police chief. This is the police chief speaking about the protests, say a little bit about the Chicago police before I end this live stream. So I'm going to share the screen here. And this is Larry Snelling. He is the police chief in Chicago. And he's being asked about just the way people are on edge about protesters coming to the city And let's dig into this just a little bit.
The number of protesters that will be downtown during this week. Should people feel like they can't come downtown during the DNC?
No, people should not feel like they can't come downtown. Again, we will have a presence there. We have a plan around protests. Listen, we hope that no matter the number of people who show up here in Chicago to protest, that they do it peacefully. They're exercising their First Amendment rights, but we want them to understand that criminal activity cannot and will not be tolerated in the city. We will not tolerate violence. We will not tolerate any type of crime that leads to vandalism, violence, anything that's going to disrupt the lives of people who are living in this city and people who came here to visit. Even when it comes to blocking traffic, things of that nature, people, like you said, they have to travel. They have to get their kids to school. They have to pick their children up. People are trying to get to hospitals. We want to make sure that people's day-to-day lives are not disrupted because there are some people who want to have their voices heard. Have your voices heard. But that doesn't mean that you get to shut down everyone else's, lives in this city. So we'll be out there to make sure that.
All right, to that point that he's making about people's lives, they have to take their kids to school. They need to get to their jobs. The Palestinians in Gaza had jobs. The Palestinians in Gaza had schools. The Palestinians in Gaza were having church functions or religious gatherings that they wanted to attend regularly. The Palestinians in Gaza went out to the markets. They went to stores or shops. The Palestinians in Gaza had weddings. They had funerals. They had gatherings, and they wouldn't want people to disrupt those either. But they can't do that anymore, can they? They can't, because they've been bombed to oblivion, and they're continuing to be terrorized by the Israeli military, who announces that zones are no longer safe, changes the safety zones. Those safe zones aren't even really safe zones. There's really no place for them to go. The cleansing of this population is such that there isn't really any safe area in Gaza. And so Larry Snelling and any official who sits there and says that they're not going to let protesters disrupt the lives of Chicagoans, they just don't get it. They just don't get that the purpose of protest is to say, no, 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 this can't continue. Look at what this government is supporting. Look at what they are doing. $20 billion more for weapons, $20 billion more for offense. It's not even cloaked under this idea that it's somehow like defense to stop Hamas rockets. No, this is because they're going to continue to bomb refugee camps. They're going to continue to bomb shelters. They've attacked hospitals. There's no place for people to go for medical treatment. There's not barely any way for humanitarian aid to get into Gaza. And we don't hear anybody saying, oh no, how come life as usual, how come business as usual has come to a halt in Gaza? And this police chief wants to say that they should stop protesters from being in the streets during the DNC. The city invited the DNC. They knew what they were doing. When you invite the DNC to your city, you are inviting the protests that come along with the Democratic National Convention. And the city council and Mayor Brandon Johnson did pass a ceasefire resolution. They did say that they support an end to this war, that they don't think it should continue. But they're welcoming a Democratic Party that is not on board with a lot of what progressive Democrats in Chicago believe. You know, these Democrats that run the party are pro-Israel, or Zionist, to be more accurate. They are people who believe in the project of apartheid, the occupied Palestinian territories. They support the open-air prison that Israel has imposed for decades, and they believe that this type of violence is acceptable and justified and can be rationalized, and they don't want to be confronted by anybody who opposes it. And they're going to talk about protesters being violent while they support much worse violence, extreme violence on the part of the Israeli government and military. And I'm not just talking about this. And I could play video after video after video. I don't really care what happens to the channel. I don't get a whole lot of people to it. So Google could demonetize me tomorrow. They could suppress my videos. I'm already going through some kind of algorithmic suppression, aren't we all, as we try to stream and express ourselves and stand up to a lot of the injustice and trampling of human rights that goes on globally, speaking up against. I spent 5 years on this channel. I spent 5 years on this channel on Julian Assange, and that didn't do my channel any favors. So I could play you the videos to back up everything that I'm saying. I just don't have the time to go through hours upon hours of footage, horrific footage, and also it's dishonorable. I'm not going to show you these children and different bits and pieces as they've been blown apart. If I could find their photos when they were kids and they were released, I would show them to you so you can see the people that are gone, the people who look like the same babies that, you know, parents. I'm a parent of a infant who's, you know, not even 1 year old yet, and these babies look like her. It's horrifying what the Democrats are allowing, and Larry wants to go on about how business as usual is going to grind to a halt. Well, that's too bad. People can tolerate protests. They understand protests are going to be at the DNC, and maybe do some research, find out what's happening in the area, and don't go there. Adjust your plans for once. I mean, this is what people would do if the Olympics were in Chicago and the city wanted to have the Olympics at one point. Okay, if the Olympics came to Chicago, people would have to change their plans because there'd be so many people here, and there's not usually a political protest attached to it, although there are things to protest about the Olympics. But the DNC brings protests, and people can adjust their lives, and we don't need to hear Larry Snelling go on and on about how business as usual can't continue while there is genocidal violence unfolding in the Middle East. It's obnoxious.
That people can go about their day to day, do the things that they do on a regular basis, and enjoy the city.
I've heard you draw this fine line between protest and rioting, and how to differentiate between the two, and training your officers to recognize this is a peaceful group of protesters and this is something that might be getting out of hand. How do you delineate the two?
Well, listen, you know, violence is always a non-starter. When we look at violent activity, when we look at attacks on people, when we look at attacks on police officers, it cannot be tolerated, because when we don't believe or feel that our officers should be protecting themselves, then you can't expect those officers to protect anyone else. So we want to make sure that when violence starts, we put an end to it as quickly as possible, because the sooner we put an end to that, we reduce the risk of further physical action. We reduce the risk of injuries, not only to our police officers, but to those that we're taking into custody. So we just want to make sure that we keep those things peaceful. The other thing, vandalism, and we've seen that. We've seen it with, spray painting, damaging windows, storefronts, things of that nature. We're not going to allow that. And arson. We saw that in 2020. If you look at the things that happened in 2020, because if we want to make that distinction, 2020 downtown area was rioting.
Step into Wix Studio, the platform.
Okay, you got enough of that. So now he's speaking about the Black Lives Matter protests after George Floyd was murdered, the uprising. People were joining in solidarity, protesting in, there's a Michigan Avenue part of Chicago. If you're ever done tourism in Chicago or come to Chicago, there's a stretch with all these luxury or boutique shops. People went up there. People were in other parts of the city demonstrating. And he is unwilling to acknowledge the role, the unlawful and violent role that police played in creating riots. And he also doesn't mention the mayor at the time was Lori Lightfoot. She raised the bridges. They were like this, and she trapped people in that section of Chicago. So they couldn't get to the trains and leave and go home once they were dispersed. So that's also a problem for police, right? Because you're trying to clear an area and people have nowhere to go. That's on them. That was a crowd control problem on their part that they created. They were investigated, and Inspector General put out a report, and they tell us that actually the police probably aren't as ready as the press thinks and the city says they are for the DNC. I'm going to get to that before I conclude this broadcast. But what he's saying there again about how people are out there and then it's going to suddenly turn violent. Most of the time, as I've observed over the last 15 years, when going to demonstrations, if it gets violent, paying attention to the times when, and this isn't just in Chicago, but everywhere, the tactics of police are such that as they become more aggressive, the protests become more angry. And as you are provoking, they become more irritable. They become more like a kind of tinderbox. And then suddenly everything erupts. And it erupts because of the tone of the police, the way that they are imposing their authority. It's rarely, look, there are small groups of people that see property damage as a valid tactic. There are some groups that want to go around and paint, like they go to people's homes and they paint, or they put chalk. I actually don't see chalk as vandalism, but that's something that the police will tell you, that they think chalking is vandalism, which is absurd. But this sort of thing, there's not even really that many people who do this during a DNC. People are coming to the city to march. They want their message to get out to Democrats. If they can get into the convention and protest, they will. If they can go in the halls and march with banners, if they can disrupt the speech at the DNC, they're going to try and do that. But beyond that, I don't think anybody is out to just set shit on fire. That kind of thing happens. And so that kind of thing happens because the police are setting this tone. And again, I have to hide the comments here because some of y'all are on one today. And I can't believe it's still going like a half hour later. I feel like the point was made. So the police are going to provoke whatever violence takes place. I can say that with all certainty, that they will determine the temperature outside. And yet, we have, like I see from Axios, House members fear DNC violence. Scoop. And these people just, they're unnamed, anonymous sources whispering in their ear, just promoting the fear, trying to get people more afraid. They're driving Chicagoans out of their city. They're leading people in the city to believe that there's going to be madness. It doesn't have to be. How about this? It doesn't have to be. These people who are coming to Chicago are not coming to destroy the city. I'm going to put out an alternative viewpoint here. I don't believe that those that are organizing for peace in Gaza are coming here to burn down the city of Chicago. So still the House Democrat, one of them tells Axios they're concerned about their personal security. Another House Democrat is telling members not to go to a certain area, that they heard from law enforcement that don't go to this area, they can expect violence. Well, I don't know what police have planned, but there won't be any violence unless the police create it. The protesters aren't staying in a designated protest site, and there are people who are going to go and really try to cause trouble. And these are lawmakers. But see, these are Democrats that are involved in perpetuating this policy of war, and it's causing a lot of destruction, which I already outlined. I won't repeat. So maybe stop doing that, and then you won't have to worry about people protesting you. You won't have to worry about your experience at the DNC being disrupted. But it's too late now. You're here. And meanwhile, while you're in Chicago for the DNC, if you turn on Al Jazeera English, you can see the horror that is still unfolding. You can see how everything is on edge. You can see how Israel is trying to pull the U.S. into a wider regional war, as they have been consciously doing for the last 3 to 4 months. And talk about that. How about when somebody asks you about the concern of disruptive protests, why don't you say, well, they might have a point. We are very concerned about how we're teetering on the edge of a massive regional conflict, rather than just, whining and complaining in fear to some reporter who is going to reprint what you say and grant you the anonymity to share your trepidation. So there's that. Now I want to read from the Inspector General report. I want to read that in this report. It says that the Chicago Police Department is not prepared to protect the First Amendment rights of people this upcoming week, that they're still using outdated tactics and vague descriptions of the limits against particularly escalatory tactics. So the way they respond and how it would escalate tension. Specifically, CPD training materials relied on outdated and inaccurate psychological theories to instruct members that crowds negatively affect individual participants, encouraging violent behavior. The Inspector General further found that CPD draft policy allows for the use of crowd control tactics, which have, both in Chicago and other cities, been used indiscriminately without distinguishing between peaceful demonstrators and individuals conducting criminal acts. Now that's key here, because Snelling is telling us that he's going to stop protests from becoming violent. Well, to do that, you'd have to be able to distinguish between the peaceful and the violent people, and they don't know how to do it. They simply are incapable of just quick, oh, that person there, they just broke a window, pull them out, but let's continue to let this entire march go. No, because the way that the police crack down creates such a scene of conflict that the whole march devolves, that also everybody starts running, that they fire pepper spray, or there's 20 cops collapse around one single individual, and they're very nearly breaking the arm of that person they're arresting, who may or may not have been the one who broke that window. So the way in which they police leads to the mayhem. And the IG, the Inspector General, is saying they haven't updated their training to limit tactics. They generalize mass event participants' capacity for violence while also teaching tactics that may be used indiscriminately against demonstrators and those committing criminal acts alike. And CPD's guidance may contribute to risks of escalating tensions and violations of constitutional rights. So there it is. If whatever video you see this coming week when constitutional rights are violated, the reporters on the ground, or the people who have come to town to protest, or the residents here that have a right to protest the DNC being here in the city, it's going to be on the CPD. And it's going to be on the city of Chicago, who will go to court later and be asked to shell out millions of dollars for violating rights. There are groups of attorneys sitting by waiting, and they'll be documenting what goes on, and then they'll be collecting whatever the city of Chicago does to people that is wrong through the police. They will be able to get a payout. So, Chicago Activism Hub. If you are in Chicago and you want to know what's going on during the DNC, you want to come out to any of the evening events, you want to go to demonstrations or be part of a march, go to chicagoactivismhub.org. And this is a bulletin board. I'm going to put this up here. This is being put together by activists, supported by activists in Chicago. So there it is. This is what the bulletin board looks like. And I'll go ahead and scroll slowly so you can get a glance at this. There's book discussions. There's a book fair, radical book fair. There's some music, protest music. The Poor People's Army has been at almost every convention for 20 plus years now. And then there's meetups. There's film screening. There's SEIU's work on ending the U.S. government blockade against Cuba. That's important. There's the march on August 22nd. I believe that concludes the convention at 5 p.m. There's some other stuff happening later on. If you're just from Chicago, fundraisers for Gaza. There's going to be a Southside Open Meetings for Treatment, Not Trauma. So that continues after the DNC leaves. This is what people in Chicago are going to be working on. So there you go. That's a flavor of the action from the grassroots that is upcoming. And so I'll be out there, hopefully mixing in and following some of the action during the week. I don't know if there will be live streams. I don't know if I'll have a chance to stop here. If I can bring somebody to the channel and talk to them about what's unfolding on the ground, I'll go ahead and do that. I'll probably have to do it from here. So I don't know if I'll be able to do it out in the field, although that would be good for, I guess, the authenticity of the interview. However, I hope to be able to track incidents if there are any attacks on the press, interference with people trying to do their jobs, because that's something that I've spent a lot of time doing through the dissenter.org. So normally I put this up and just tell people if you would like to subscribe, go to the dissenter.org. There's a sign up. You can get it for free. Or you can support it if you believe in independent journalism. And then the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast is over at Patreon, patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure. That's patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure. I'm going to go ahead and put this, quickly typed out a little banner there that I can put up there. So the interview with Andy was part of that weekly show. Because the DNC is coming, I rushed it and got it out. Normally, episodes are available exclusively for several days, and then a version of it, cut shorter, is made available to everybody. And that's how that usually works. And then finally, thank you for being here. Let me check into the comments and just put up a few things that I saw that I was really gratified to see. I don't know you extra, but somebody saying that they're going to be hopefully interviewing some demonstrators if possible. Good on you to be there. And by the way, you cannot find any good information on the DNC and protests on the platform formerly known as Twitter right now, because you just see a lot of people posting that there are going to be 30,000 Antifa in Chicago without any source for that information at all. And that has clogged it up and made it impossible to know what's what. So send people to the Chicago Activism Hub if they're looking for information on when protests start. And also, if you're looking for the organizations that will actually be doing good work to challenge the Democrats, those are the groups you should follow. And they're better than the out-of-towners. The out-of-towners, I hope, are going to be joining and falling in with those groups who've already done the work to get permits and hold the rallies and organize these actions. I see a lot of you talking about agents provocateurs. I mean, like, you could say that for any event, any national special security event. I'll keep my eyes open if I see anybody. Sometimes they really stick out. And if they do get in the way and I can document it, you of course have to be careful. You got to prove that they're really that. I'm focused on the police that are clothed and the people who are trying to have their voices heard. And then later on, if through FOIA, I can figure out who infiltrated, the way that Andy was able to figure out that police had infiltrated the anti-war meetings. But yeah, just to presume that there's going to be undercover officers in different pockets of the demonstration who are going to be pointing and trying to single out individuals along the way if they think they're supposed to be arrested or should be arrested. That's what'll happen. And I saw one more comment I just wanted to put up and say thank you for, and then I'll end this. It was really good to talk with you. It'd been a long time since I'd done a live stream, so it was nice to be able to have an opportunity. Oh, this one, because it was very nice, Lexa, for you to put this out there. It means a lot, and we'll take that down. And so I will see you in the streets. I don't normally make it to the streets, being a new parent, being very involved in independent journalism. I don't usually get the opportunity to go out there and see groups, but I'm going to have a chance this upcoming week. And with the DNC coming to Chicago, I didn't feel I could ignore it. So I'll be there and I'll share some of what I see with you. So if you're interested in what I witness or any observations I have from the coming week, stay tuned to this channel. Until then, have a good evening. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you around.